The gun went off in silence. No scream, no frantic footsteps, just the faint echo bouncing off brick and brownstone, fading into the night like it had never been there. In that moment, every man in the alley, every shadow on the sidewalk, understood that something irrevocable had occurred. The king of Harlem, the man whose very name carried the weight of loyalty, respect, and fear, Bumpy Johnson, had been defended, not by himself, but by the quiet, unyielding hand of his bodyguard. The tension had been building for weeks, whispered in the smoky back rooms of jazz clubs, and overheard at the corner stores where men discussed deals and betrayals in hushed tones. Rival factions had been testing boundaries, pushing, prodding, daring the king to react. But Bumpy Johnson was no man to act on impulse. He measured his responses like a chess master, calculating the weight of each move before striking. And that night, the chessboard had shifted with a single controlled action, the pull of a trigger that reminded the streets who held power. Harlem was alive with light and shadow, a city of music and menace. The air smelled of rain-soaked asphalt and tobacco smoke, mingling with the faint sweetness of late-night fried chicken and the distant clatter of horse-drawn wagons from a city that still clung to its older rhythms. On Lenox Avenue, men and women went about their business, but the undercurrent of tension was palpable. Word traveled fast, and those who knew the signs of imminent change felt the shift in the air. Something had happened that would ripple across the streets for weeks to come. Bumpy Johnson stood a few steps away, calm as ever, his gaze fixed not on the bodyguard, but on the reaction of the city itself. Every man in the alley knew that loyalty had a price and that protection under the king was absolute. But that price was not always paid in words. It was paid in action, and that action had just been delivered with precision. The bodyguard, a man known for his silent loyalty and measured demeanor, lowered the gun slowly. His eyes scanned the alley, taking in every movement, every shadow, every expression. He didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He understood the lesson embedded in that moment. Power in Harlem was demonstrated, not declared. Respect was earned, not demanded. And the streets, they would never forget the sound that had just written history in their midst. Across the city, rival operators paused in their plotting. The sound had carried farther than anyone could have expected, a quiet yet undeniable declaration. The king's reach extended beyond the obvious, beyond the immediate presence of Bumpy Johnson himself. Even unseen, even in the quietest moments, his influence dictated the rules of the game. And that night, through the precise act of his bodyguard, the rules had been enforced. The streets were no strangers to violence, but there was a difference between chaos and order, between impulsive shooting and calculated action. This was the latter. It was a demonstration of intelligence and loyalty, an unmistakable reminder that the king's network was flawless and his men unbreakable. The community, while aware of the potential for danger, also recognized the implicit protection such action provided. In Harlem, there were codes unwritten but universally understood, and one had just been reaffirmed. The king's justice was swift, accurate, and unavoidable. Inside the dimly lit apartments above the shops, the whispers began immediately. Shopkeepers leaned out their windows, listening, guessing, confirming what they already feared and respected. Even the lawmen, trained and experienced as they were, understood that this was not a routine dispute. This was a statement, and in statements like these, there was clarity. There was consequence. There was history being written with every heartbeat in the city that night. Bumpy Johnson didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was felt in every glance exchanged in the alley. His authority, demonstrated through the decisive act of his bodyguard, was absolute. That single shot had conveyed more than words ever could. Challenge the king, and the streets themselves will respond with precision, loyalty, and consequence. By the time the first sirens echoed in the distance, the immediate danger had passed. The rivals had retreated into the shadows, their plans disrupted, their respect reaffirmed, and Bumpy Johnson, as always, remained the eye of the storm, quiet, controlled, legendary. His bodyguard, though unseen by most, had become the vessel of that legend, the instrument through which the king's dominance was enforced. That night would be recounted in hushed tones and later in bolder ones across the neighborhood. It was not the violence itself that would be remembered, but the clarity of intent, the unmistakable display of disciplined authority, and the reminder that Bumpy Johnson's empire was not just a collection of streets and numbers. It was a network of loyalty, intelligence, and an almost sacred adherence to the rules of respect. And as the city exhaled, the quiet that followed the gunshot carried a message louder than any words. In Harlem, power was absolute, loyalty was eternal, and the king's men would act in silence, but with consequences felt for years to come. To understand the magnitude of what had just occurred, one had to understand Bumpy Johnson, not the man painted in sensational headlines, but the one who walked Harlem with a weight no one could challenge. Born in 1905 in the rough edges of New York, Bumpy had grown into a figure both feared and revered. He moved like a king among men, carrying the elegance of a gentleman and the ruthlessness of a tactician. The streets whispered his name not out of fear alone, but because respect followed him like a shadow. Harlem in the 1940s was a city of contradictions, jazz and poverty, music and menace, prosperity and persecution. Segregation carved invisible boundaries, and law enforcement often had fingers in multiple pies, enforcing laws selectively while the streets enforced their own justice. The community lived under dual realities, outwardly compliant with the law, inwardly loyal to those who protected them when the system failed. And Bumpy Johnson had carved his place at the top of this intricate balance. He was more than a gangster. He was a guardian of a kind of street justice, a man who understood that the lines between crime and protection often blurred. For decades, he had walked the line, commanding respect not only from his own men, but from the rival factions, the politicians who sought influence, and even the police who grudgingly acknowledged his power. Harlem had its kings, but Bumpy's reign was subtle yet unyielding, a dominion defined as much by presence as by action. The bodyguard who fired that single silent shot was a product of Bumpy's meticulous standards. Not every man could carry a gun for the king. Loyalty alone was insufficient. Discipline, precision, and an unshakable sense of timing were required. This man had proven himself in countless ways before that night. Yet it was this one act, the quiet execution of authority under direct threat, that cemented his place in Harlem's whispered history. He had acted not out of fear, not out of ego, but out of the unspoken code. defend the king, enforce the law of the streets, and let consequences speak louder than words. The tension that night had begun weeks earlier. Harlem's underworld was never dormant. Rival factions tested boundaries constantly, challenging territories, pushing limits, trying to provoke a reaction. But Bumpy was patient. Every slight, every provocation was measured. His eyes missed nothing. The bodyguard, always close, absorbed these lessons without the need for lectures. He knew the signs, the patterns, and the inevitable culmination. Confrontation. And when it came, he executed with a precision that left no room for argument. In the alley, the stillness after the shot was palpable. Even the rats seemed to pause in the gutters, the echoes of the city bending towards silence, as if the streets themselves were holding their breath. This was not random violence. This was a declaration of authority, a recalibration of power. Every rival faction in Harlem understood it. Every man who considered disrespecting Bumpy would think twice. Every whisper of betrayal carried the memory of that night. The king himself remained calm, an unshakable figure amidst the human turbulence. He surveyed the alley, his sharp eyes noting every reaction. The retreat of would-be assailants, the confusion in the faces of those who had hoped to intimidate him, the unspoken awe of the bodyguard who had acted. Bumpy Johnson never needed to raise his voice. His presence, amplified through the loyal hands of his men, carried the weight of history, of strategy, and of the street's eternal code. For the residents of Harlem, the story was already forming, even before it would be told. In the bars, behind the counters, in the pews of the churches, people would recount the sound and the silence that followed. It wasn't just a gunshot. They knew instinctively that it represented order, justice. A reminder that power was not to be taken lightly and loyalty was not a word. It was an action. And in the complex ecosystem of Harlem streets, that single action was worth 1,000 warnings. Even law enforcement could not ignore it. Precincts recorded the disturbances, the street chatter, the ripple effects of the event. Yet no one could directly challenge the king without risking consequences far beyond ordinary reckoning. And that was Bumpy's genius. His authority was both overt and invisible, immediate and lasting. The gunshot in the alley was a moment, yes, but its meaning would echo for years, a permanent fixture in the oral history of Harlem's underworld. Bumpy Johnson understood the economy of power. Every man, every ally, every adversary was a player in a game defined by respect, fear, and opportunity. That night, the bodyguard acted as the instrument of that understanding, translating Bumpy's calculated patience into an irrefutable statement. The streets learned once again that challenge without consequence was an illusion. And in Harlem, illusions were luxury few could afford. The bodyguard stepped back into the shadows, the silent hero whose deed would never appear in newspapers, whose presence would rarely be acknowledged publicly, but whose action cemented the hierarchy of power. Loyalty had its rewards, but its most profound reward was relevance, the unspoken guarantee that you were part of something larger, a living testament to a legend in motion. And in Harlem, legends were the only constants, the unchanging truths amidst the city's ceaseless churn of ambition and betrayal. The tension had been building for days before the night. The gun went off. Harlem was a powder keg, and every interaction was a spark. Rival gangs tested boundaries subtly at first. Trash, left on a corner, a street vendor intimidated, a whispered insult in a nightclub. But Bumpy Johnson observed it all, patient as a chess master. He understood that power was measured not just in action, but in restraint. The bodyguard, standing a step behind him in every gathering, had learned this discipline. He knew the king's signals, the way a slight tightening of a jaw could indicate an order, the way a glance could warn of impending danger. The antagonist in this story wasn't just a rival. He was an ambitious upstart from a neighboring territory, a man who had gained a following by flouting the unspoken rules of the streets. He had begun to encroach on Harlem's corners, disrupting trade, intimidating Bumpy's allies, and questioning the authority of the man who had, for decades, maintained order in a community that lived by codes older than the police precincts themselves. This man was clever, ruthless, and arrogant, qualities that made him a threat. For weeks, he had made subtle challenges. He sent men into Bumpy's territory with instructions that bordered on provocation, testing the bodyguard's reaction, hoping to expose weakness. He spoke with merchants, promising protection if they broke loyalty to the king. And he underestimated Bumpy Johnson completely. Because while Bumpy might not confront every slight immediately, every insult was noted, every infringement catalogued. Patience in the world of Harlem's underground was not a sign of weakness. It was a strategic advantage. On the night of the confrontation, the air was thick with tension. Harlem's streets seemed to shrink in size, crowded with eyes that watched, whispered, and waited. The bodyguard moved with measured calm, the weight of his responsibility pressing on his shoulders. They met the upstart and his men in a narrow alley, the only light coming from a single flickering street lamp that cast elongated shadows along the brick walls. The rival gang had numbers, but not experience, not precision, not the quiet, lethal coordination that came from years under the king's tutelage. Words were exchanged first. The rival's tone was mocking, designed to provoke. He tried to belittle Bumpy's authority, sneering as he questioned the king's power in his own territory. But Bumpy Johnson stood unmoved, his gaze steady, his voice calm yet commanding. "This is my neighborhood," he said. "Every man who walks here knows it. You're learning that the hard way." The bodyguard understood immediately that the moment had escalated beyond negotiation. Years of training, loyalty, and intuition had brought him to this precise point. He moved into position, hand near his concealed weapon, senses sharpened. Every muscle was coiled, ready. He didn't hesitate, didn't question. The king had commanded control, and now it would be enforced. Then, without a word, the gun went off. Silence followed, thick, oppressive, as if the city itself had stopped breathing. The sound was not loud, but it was definitive. The antagonist staggered back, and chaos erupted among his men. Panic spread quickly. They had underestimated the bodyguard, underestimated the discipline that came from serving a man like Bumpy Johnson. Streets that had been tense seconds before now erupted into motion, some fleeing, others frozen, realizing the magnitude of what had just transpired. Bumpy remained calm. He surveyed the scene, noting the reactions of every witness, every adversary. His presence alone stabilized the chaos, like a general standing unshaken in the center of a battlefield. He understood that the bodyguard's action was more than a defensive measure. It was a statement. The hierarchy of power had been reinforced in an instant, and the message was clear. Any man who challenged the king would face consequences precise, swift, and unyielding. The upstart, humiliated and injured, retreated with the remnants of his crew, nursing wounds that were more than physical. His ambition had collided with an immovable force, and the lesson was delivered with brutal clarity. Harlem's underworld absorbed it immediately. Word traveled fast, through whispers in barbershops, through murmurs in clubs, through the silent acknowledgement of street vendors who had witnessed the scene. Respect, earned and maintained by the king, was reaffirmed. The bodyguard, though anonymous to most, became an unspoken legend among those who knew the streets intimately. His action demonstrated the essence of loyalty, courage, and strategic execution. He had followed Bumpy's guidance, executed with perfect timing, and ensured that the king's reputation remained untarnished. In Harlem, where reputation was currency, this was invaluable. Even as the night settled and the immediate danger dissipated, the streets remained charged. Every alley, every corner seemed to hum with the echoes of that silent gunshot. Merchants, bystanders, and those with business interests in Harlem recalibrated their behavior. Alliances shifted subtly, rival factions hesitated before making moves, and Bumpy Johnson's authority solidified further. The king didn't need to celebrate, didn't need to boast. The action spoke for itself. In the intricate dance of street power, the bodyguard had struck a note that resonated far beyond the alley where it had occurred. For Bumpy, the event was confirmation, not surprise. He had trained, instructed, and trusted his men to act when necessary, and tonight the lesson had been delivered with clarity. The streets were reminded. Loyalty was rewarded, disrespect punished, and power demanded recognition. The bodyguard's role, though largely unseen by the public, was now part of Harlem's living memory, a testament to the unspoken code that governed life in the city's underworld. The upstart learned what many before him had learned in their own ways. Harlem had a king, and he did not tolerate challenges lightly. His reputation, once a source of bravado, was now tarnished by the memory of that single silent act of enforcement. And the bodyguard, through precise execution, had changed the narrative, ensuring that Bumpy Johnson's reign remained uncontested, untarnished, and unquestionably legendary. The aftermath of that night was immediate, yet subtle, a ripple that spread quietly but unmistakably through every corner of Harlem. The alley where the gun had gone off remained cordoned by shadow and rumor, the faint smell of gunpowder lingering in the damp night air for days. Onlookers whispered about the precision of the act, the way the bodyguard had moved, how the king had remained unshaken while the upstart and his crew had fled. It became a story repeated in hushed tones across barbershops, jazz clubs, and newsstands. A narrative of authority reinforced without chaos consuming the streets. Bumpy Johnson understood the power of perception. To some, it might have seemed that the king had allowed violence to unfold, but those who knew him understood it differently. Every action, every word, every silent signal from him carried intention. He didn't react hastily. He observed, calculated, and only allowed a response when it would assert control without unnecessary risk. His bodyguard's shot was not impulsive. It was premeditated in the sense that it executed the king's will perfectly. It sent a message to the upstart, to his followers, and to anyone considering a challenge. Harlem had rules, and Bumpy Johnson enforced them. The rival gangs' retreat created a vacuum in the streets. Those who had been loyal to the challenger wavered, reconsidering their allegiances in light of the king's unyielding presence. Neighborhood merchants who had once hesitated to support Bumpy found courage in the silence of that night. Respect, often intangible, had been codified by a single act of decisive loyalty. Bumpy's bodyguard, usually invisible in public eyes, had demonstrated what made the king invincible: a network of men trained not merely in strength, but in discernment, timing, and absolute loyalty. Inside Bumpy's inner circle, the atmosphere was a mixture of relief and sober reflection. The bodyguard, usually quiet and disciplined, felt a weight lift as he realized the significance of his action. The king's eyes met his for a long moment, a glance that conveyed approval, pride, and the unspoken bond between mentor and protector. Words were unnecessary. The streets themselves would recount the story in the weeks to come. Yet, the king knew the true work was just beginning. Harlem's balance was delicate. Even after the confrontation, whispers of rebellion simmered among rival factions, fueled by ambition and fear. Bumpy's response had reinforced his authority, but it also served as a warning. Challenge him, and you would face consequences. The king's strength lay not just in dominance, but in consistency. Every corner, every ally, every adversary was reminded that his word, his command, and his oversight extended beyond what the eye could see. The community's reaction, though indirect, was powerful. Residents watched the streets with renewed confidence, knowing that the violence had been controlled, that the king protected his own. Vendors reopened shops with fewer worries of intimidation. Mothers walked children to school without dread of random skirmishes. Harlem's pulse normalized, though undercurrents of vigilance persisted. Bumpy Johnson's reputation, built over years of careful navigation through alliances and rivalries, had been affirmed once more. The streets did not merely fear him, they respected him. The bodyguard's role in all of this became part of Harlem's living legend. Among those in the know, men and women who understood the silent codes of survival, he was the embodiment of precision, courage, and unwavering loyalty. While history would often credit Bumpy alone, insiders knew that the king's strength was multiplied by those who acted with his vision in mind. That night, the streets themselves had witnessed a lesson in discipline and authority. Loyalty, executed at the right moment, could reshape destinies. For the upstart who had challenged Harlem's king, the lesson was brutal and immediate. He had walked into a territory he didn't understand, carrying arrogance like armor. But the shot, quiet, decisive, controlled, shattered that armor. Word of the event spread among rival factions, leaving a lasting mark on the underworld hierarchy. Ambition, without respect for established authority, was a dangerous gamble. And in Harlem, the king's reach extended beyond fear. It commanded obedience, loyalty, and enduring respect. In the following weeks, Bumpy maintained a visible yet controlled presence. He visited clubs, checked on allies, and made discreet rounds through the neighborhoods. Each appearance reminded the streets that the balance had been restored and that the king's authority was absolute. No unnecessary violence followed. Instead, a subtle realignment of power occurred. Friends were reassured, enemies recalibrated, and the bodyguard, silent as ever, remained by the king's side, a living symbol of readiness and precision. The lesson extended beyond immediate rivals. Even within Bumpy's own network, younger men watched, learned, and internalized the principles of discipline and timing. Violence without strategy, loyalty without understanding, action without calculation. These were errors the king did not tolerate. And the bodyguard had exemplified exactly how to execute authority with perfect alignment to the king's intentions. By the time Harlem settled into its rhythm again, the story of the gunshot had taken on legendary proportions. It was told as a tale of discipline, loyalty, and calculated enforcement. Children would hear fragments, merchants would recount it quietly, and historians of the streets would note how a single precise act could define the power structure for years to come. Bumpy Johnson's reign, unchallenged and resolute, had been reaffirmed. The bodyguard's action had not only prevented immediate chaos, but had reinforced the underlying order that the king's power depended upon. Even in the broader context of Harlem's complex criminal and social landscape, that night became a reference point. Rival gangs knew the consequences of miscalculation. Law enforcement recognized, at least informally, that some codes could not be violated without repercussions. The king had maintained a delicate equilibrium, protecting his own, punishing the disloyal, and ensuring the community's integrity. And the bodyguard, whose hand had fired the shot that echoed in silence, had changed everything. One disciplined action, perfectly timed, had rewritten the street's understanding of authority. The streets of Harlem carried whispers long after the echo of that gunshot had faded. But whispers had power. They shaped alliances, dictated loyalties, and clarified the hierarchy that the king had worked decades to construct. Bumpy Johnson's bodyguard, once an almost invisible figure in the king's shadow, now bore the weight of legend alongside him. Every move he made was scrutinized, every glance interpreted, and every presence reinforced the myth of Harlem's inviolable order. In the immediate aftermath, Bumpy convened with his closest lieutenants in a dimly lit back room of a neighborhood jazz club. The air smelled of smoke and bourbon, a faint trace of gunpowder still clinging to the walls from earlier confrontations. The men sat in silence for a moment, letting the gravity of the night settle. Each understood that what had occurred was more than a simple act of violence. It was a declaration, a demonstration of precision loyalty, and an assertion of power that could not be questioned. "Everything we do," Bumpy began, his voice calm but cutting through the thick haze, "has consequences. That shot tonight, it wasn't about fear. It was about understanding the order we maintain here. Respect is not given. It's earned, and it's enforced." His lieutenants nodded, their expressions a mixture of relief and reverence. The bodyguard, standing quietly in the corner, felt the weight of that recognition. He had acted under strict instructions, yet the decision in the moment, when to fire, when to hold back, was his alone. Bumpy had trusted him implicitly, and now that trust had been proven beyond doubt. Across Harlem, reactions varied. The community, while aware of the violence, saw it as controlled, precise, and necessary. Parents whispered to children not in fear of chaos, but in awe of the silent authority that kept the streets in balance. Merchants reopened their shops with newfound courage, confident that the king's enforcement extended to their protection. Even those outside Bumpy's inner circle recognized a shift in power, a reminder that Harlem's streets operated under an unspoken code, and transgressions carried serious repercussions. But not all reactions were quiet. Rival factions scrambled to reassess. Men who had once spoken defiantly now murmured carefully, calculating their next moves with a new understanding of risk. The gunshot had been more than a warning. It had been a lesson in timing, strategy, and the unflinching execution of loyalty. To challenge Bumpy Johnson now meant more than facing him. It meant confronting every man and every measure he had meticulously placed around his kingdom. The bodyguard became a figure of respect within the organization. Younger men who aspired to rise observed his every action, his restraint, his timing. He had acted with deadly precision, yet he had preserved the dignity of the king. There was no unnecessary chaos, no reckless bravado. In Harlem's silent code, that distinction mattered. Violence executed without judgment was dangerous. Violence executed with purpose became legend. Bumpy continued to patrol his territory personally, not in defiance, but in demonstration. He met shopkeepers, nodded to barbers, exchanged brief words with mothers and children. His presence was a living reassurance, a visible manifestation of the order he maintained. And always, the bodyguard was nearby, a silent sentinel whose actions had already cemented his place in the street's unwritten history. Meanwhile, law enforcement took notice. Detectives and precinct officers, many of whom had underestimated the king, adjusted their strategies. They recognized that Harlem was no longer merely a neighborhood under observation. It was a stronghold of precise, disciplined power. Attempts to undermine the king's authority were futile. The streets had already been instructed on the consequences. In this delicate balance between public order and street power, Bumpy had secured a form of justice that law enforcement could not impose. Even within rival circles, whispers circulated about the bodyguard's shot. Stories varied. Some exaggerated the distance, others praised the accuracy. But every retelling carried the same lesson. Authority must be recognized, loyalty must be executed, and hesitation could be fatal. For every man considering defiance, the narrative had shifted irrevocably. Respect, once optional, was now mandatory. Harlem itself seemed to breathe differently in the days that followed. There was a rhythm to the streets, a subtle pulse of acknowledgement that the king's command remained absolute. Children played in yards without fear of encroaching violence. Shopkeepers hung signs with quiet pride, their businesses safeguarded not just by force, but by the presence of order. And in the shadowed corners where illicit deals were made, even the boldest whispers carried a new weight. The understanding that one disciplined act could change everything. In his private moments, Bumpy reflected on the balance he maintained. Authority was not just about intimidation. It was about timing, precision, and the careful selection of when to act. The gunshot, though brief and singular, had exemplified this philosophy perfectly. The bodyguard's choice, guided by Bumpy's instructions, had reinforced a pattern. The king's influence extended beyond mere words. It was demonstrated through deliberate, controlled, and perfectly executed action. The ripple effect continued. Within months, rival factions either aligned themselves with the king or retreated to peripheral roles, hesitant to provoke the consequences of misjudgment. The streets had been rewritten, not through indiscriminate violence, but through disciplined enforcement of a clear hierarchy. Loyalty, respect, and obedience were no longer abstract concepts. They were operational realities codified in the aftermath of one decisive night. In Harlem, the legend of that night endured. It was not told as a tale of fear or chaos. It was a narrative of control, of respect enforced, of loyalty rewarded. Bumpy Johnson had reaffirmed his reign, but it was the bodyguard's hand, steady, precise, loyal, that had ensured the lesson was understood. Together, they had reshaped the street's understanding of power and the consequences of crossing the king's path. Months turned into years, but the echo of that night remained a defining moment in Harlem's living memory. The bodyguard, once anonymous in the shadows, became a quiet symbol of disciplined power. His actions, though executed in near silence, resonated loudly through the networks of loyalty and respect that Bumpy Johnson had spent decades constructing. Every corner, every stoop, every alleyway seemed to carry the memory of that single, controlled gunshot, an audible lesson in authority and consequence. Bumpy's reputation solidified further, not through the mythic retelling of violence, but through the tangible effects it had on the streets. Rivals learned quickly that Harlem's king did not act on impulse. He acted on principle, and he had men around him who would enforce those principles with precision. The bodyguard's role became emblematic of this philosophy. He was the extension of Bumpy's judgment, the living proof that loyalty paired with restraint was more formidable than reckless aggression. Neighborhood elders recounted the event to the younger generation not as a story of fear, but as an affirmation of order. "Respect is everything," they would say, nodding toward the bodyguard whenever he appeared in public. He fired once, and the streets never doubted who's in charge again. The legend was no longer confined to whispers in back rooms. It was woven into the rhythm of daily life. Kids playing stickball, shopkeepers tending their stores, street vendors calling out their wares. All moved within the cadence set by a man who understood that authority was earned through measured action, not terror alone. Even outside Harlem, the implications were felt. Law enforcement and rival crime syndicates alike recognized a subtle but unmistakable shift in the balance of power. Attempts to challenge Bumpy's influence were met not just with loyalty-driven enforcement, but with the understanding that the king's network was precise, disciplined, and highly observant. The gunshot that had changed one night's course now reverberated in strategy meetings, courtroom whispers, and clandestine negotiations. One act had rewritten the rules of engagement for those daring enough to step into Harlem's streets. The bodyguard himself became a figure of silent reverence. Unlike many in Harlem who sought notoriety or personal gain, he moved with deliberate purpose, always aware that his reputation was built not on flamboyance, but on reliability. Younger men in the organization studied him, noting his restraint, his timing, his ability to enforce power without undermining dignity. In a culture where reckless bravado often invited disaster, he became a model for how discipline could translate into long-term influence. For Bumpy, the consequences of that night were manifold. The king's authority was uncontested, his territory fully respected, his network of loyalty stronger than ever. The bodyguard's decisive action had not only prevented immediate threats, but had also instilled a system of calculated accountability that would influence Harlem's underworld for years to come. What might have been a moment of chaos instead became a cornerstone of structured power. Harlem itself, more than ever, felt like a community under protective vigilance. The streets operated under a tacit agreement. Loyalty would be rewarded, disrespect would be corrected, and authority would not be questioned lightly. The legend of that night entered into the oral history of the neighborhood, not as a glorified tale of violence, but as a definitive lesson in leadership, strategy, and the quiet enforcement of respect. By the time the first anniversary of the incident arrived, even those on the periphery, rival dealers, opportunistic hustlers, and curious observers, recognized the pattern. Bumpy Johnson's command was absolute, reinforced not just by his presence, but by the skill and judgment of those he trusted most. The bodyguard had become inseparable from the king's mythos, a living testament to the fact that the execution of power was as much about timing and precision as it was about strength. In every corner of Harlem, from the stoops to the back alleys, people understood that night had changed more than just one encounter. It had redefined the way authority was exercised. The gun shot in silence had rewritten history, not through fear alone, but through the disciplined assertion of loyalty, respect, and measured force. And in that rewriting, Bumpy Johnson's legend and the legend of the bodyguard who executed his will was cemented for generations. That night, when the gun went off in silence, it was more than a single act of protection. It was a statement. In the dimly lit streets of Harlem, where every gesture carried meaning and every glance could signal allegiance or betrayal, the bodyguard's action spoke louder than words. It reminded everyone watching that authority was not claimed through noise, but maintained through precision, discipline, and unshakable loyalty. Bumpy Johnson's empire was not built on chaos. It was built on order, enforced with calculated resolve. The bodyguard's decisive moment became a reflection of that principle. It showed the world, and especially those who underestimated the king, that true power did not need fanfare. It required judgment, courage, and the understanding that every action carried consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate scene. For Harlem, that night was a turning point. Respect, once casually granted and easily lost, became anchored in the memory of one silent gunshot. Community members, rival factions, and even law enforcement began to see Bumpy Johnson not merely as a gangster, but as a man whose influence demanded recognition, whose presence shaped the rhythm of the streets, and whose principles dictated the behavior of everyone who walked within his territory. The bodyguard's legend, intertwined with Bumpy's, became a quiet yet undeniable lesson for generations. Loyalty without recklessness is more powerful than blind aggression. Respect, once earned, commands far more than fear ever could. And a single moment, executed with precision, can redefine an entire community's understanding of authority. This wasn't just about one night. It wasn't about the flash of a weapon or the instant it discharged. It was about the message left behind, the lesson that power, when wielded with intelligence and loyalty, becomes immortal. And sometimes it takes the unseen hand of a trusted guardian to remind the world why a legend deserves his crown. In Harlem's history and in the echoes of its streets, that night remains a story whispered with reverence. It was a testament to the disciplined enforcement of respect, the quiet orchestration of justice, and the enduring legacy of a king, and the bodyguard who ensured his authority would never be questioned again. This was more than protection. This was legend.